Hello everyone, Jill Whalen here with another live video for you. This one is interesting, I think. It may sound similar to other ones I've done, but I've had some insights over the past few days that is at least having me see this at a little bit deeper level, so we'll see if my talking about it at all makes any sense. But what I called this one was, what if our or your anxiety isn't actually your anxiety at all, but a separate entity? Now, I know that probably may not make much sense to people, but let me explain it a little more. What I'm hearing from some various places of stuff that I read and listen to. In fact, I would suggest, I can put some links, but one person that's really talks differently about this stuff is someone named Paul Hederman. He comes from a recovery background, or the addiction and stuff, but he has seen through the whole idea of ourself, which is something that I explore, because it's that feeling of having a self that's what's creating all of our issues, like anxiety. So what Paul Hederman talks about is, he calls it selfing, S-E-L-F-I-N-G. It's a verb. It's a thing that we're doing. We are not a self. We are selfing. And he was talking about, in terms of like addiction, that you know, he was clean and sober for a couple of years, and then at some point he got out of his recovery center that he was in, and he somehow thought he started hearing this entity within him telling him it was a good idea to maybe go hang out at a bar again. And he did, and after that, you know, he was back on the track of addiction again, the cycle of it, because this entity, right? This entity came into him, let's call it this alcoholism, or this addictive entity came into him and basically took over his body. Now, it sounds weird, but that's what we're all doing. That's what's happening to all of us. Like, you could say that that's the same thing with anxiety, right? This anxious, not identity, what's the word I'm thinking of? Entity. This anxious entity sort of comes into our head, let's say. It doesn't, I mean, this is sort of metaphoric, and it starts saying all these things like, shouldn't you be worried about this and that, and what if this happens, and all these things. And it's giving this whole long narration in our minds, but it's the same anxious entity that it's floating around and going through all people's heads who are anxious, right? Because everyone has their own little flavor of it. And so it's just this entity that's floating around, providing all these anxious thoughts, and then we think it's us, but it's really just it's this entity that's taken over our body, and then we listen to it because we think it's us. And this has to do with, like I talked about last week, I think, disidentifying with our thoughts. It's the same thing, but somehow my seeing it at this deeper level, it's not even like disidentifying seems like something you have to do. Okay, this isn't me, but the more you actually see it as this separate entity, or Eckhart Tolle sort of, he talks about it, if you've ever read him, that it's basically the same thing as what the pain body would be. It just takes you over. And then, so with anxiety, it just takes you over with anxious thoughts. But if we realize what it is, the separate entity that's not us, and it's the same entity floating around to all these different people. Like the anxious thoughts are the same ones. Everybody has there's not like new anxious thoughts. Everybody has the same ones. They're different flavor depending on our situation. You know, who's in our life, what's happening in our life. But anxiety in general is just this general thing that we all have these same thoughts floating through because of it. And it can be the same with anger. Like suddenly when you see people who have anger issues, they just out of nowhere sometimes can their anger entity, right? Not their anger entity, the anger entity. You can kind of picture it as almost like this cloud. It goes from person to person, seeing who it can, who will bite, who will believe that it's them, and it just suddenly latches onto one person at the right time, and suddenly they burst out in this anger thing out of nowhere. I mean, we've all seen that happen with either ourselves or other people that we know, and it's because that anger entity floats through. It's a movement that floats on by, grabs us. We buy into it, think it's us, think it's a good idea, whatever it's saying, and we do it. And then later we basically wake up from awareness and say, what the hell was that? Why did I just react that way? So it could be anger, it could be anxiety, it could be addiction, just insecurity, right? That's the main one that stems all these other ones. This insecure entity coming through, oh, nobody loves you, you're not good enough, blah, blah, blah. And when we don't realize that it's this entity that's floating on through and grabbing everybody as it can, when we think that's us, that we believe those thoughts, we think they're our thoughts, we claim them as ours, instead of realizing that it's just this entity that floats through to everyone. That's when we're in trouble. That's when we get caught up with it, and it takes us over until we wake up again and say, what the hell happened? It's like a dream in a way, when we get caught up by this entity that's floating through us. So I don't know. It's a different way to think about it. I've heard this for a long time by listening to people who talk about this, and it just clicked at a deeper level. It's everything that we think is ourself is really this entity that's taking different flavors. So something to consider, ponder. Any questions, let me know. I'll also post a link over to some of the Paul Hederman videos. He has his YouTube channel is called Zen Bitch Slap, which is a cute name, but he's different. You have to not be sensitive to language, because he drops a lot of F-bombs. All right, I'll catch you later. Bye.